Hello and good evening or good morning or whatever time it is that you're watching this video. By way of introduction, I am John. I'm the managing director of Honeycomb Strategy, and I just wanted to say thank you to Pendula for inviting me to tour with them as part of the Splendor in the SaaS Roadshow. I've had the pleasure of attending the Sydney event and presenting these insights in the Melbourne event as well. And for those who didn't get a chance to see me speak, I thought I'd do a quick recording and give you a sneak peek at some of the insights. So, without further ado, I'm going to share my screen and tell you a bit of a story. Now, to give you a little bit of context about what we have done and what we're going to share today. So, Honeycomb is a market research agency. We specialize in a couple key areas. So, we help brands in service, tech, and retail with their product market fit, go to market strategy, and brand strategy. One way we do this is through what we call the Digital Insight series. What I can share could cover hours of content. We don't have hours, unfortunately. We could save that for another day. But what I wanted to do was pull out some really key nuggets that will give you some value over the next 15 or 20 minutes. Now, what is the Digital Insight series, you ask? Well, it's a series of releases that we fund, developed in collaboration with our clients for our clients. Um, Essentially, what it is, it's a series of insights designed for brands that operate in the digital space to help them understand how they can win with consumers when it comes to digital engagement. What I'm here to share with you tonight is some nuggets, as I mentioned before, on two of our initial releases that came out this year. The first piece came out in February called Brands Beyond Breaches, which is a deep dive around data privacy and its relationship with brand trust. And then our second release, which came out just a couple months ago, and we're still rolling it out, is around omnichannel advantage. So really helping to understand how brands can capture market share in the digital age. Now, where I wanted to start first was around this story around data privacy. And I'm sure you, myself, like many consumers, over the past few years have seen a lot of really interesting things that have made us, I guess, question whether data online is safe. And what we have absolutely seen as part of our research is data privacy concerns are absolutely increasingly impact how people behave online. Really clear example is the fact that we are seeing and hearing about data breaches every day. In our data, we spoke to 1,000 consumers, and from that information, we found that 4 in 5 said that they're hearing about data breaches now more than they have ever done before. You combine this with the fact that when it comes to a choice between data privacy versus a personalized experience, we found more than three-quarters of the population valued privacy over personalized experience. This would be interesting in and of itself, but what we actually found was that over the 3 years that we've been doing this piece of work post Cambridge Analytica, it's been increasing year on year. And even just as a frame of reference, it's increased 5% from 2023, which was the last time we did it. What's driving this, you may ask? Obviously, data breaches have a role to play, but there's absolutely more than that. What we found deep diving into this was that Australians felt that while they've been sharing their data with brands for a long time, consumers don't really feel that they're seeing that value exchange. And so when we asked the question whether they agree or disagree with the statement of not getting any value from companies asking for lots of information about myself, roughly three-quarters of the population agreed with that statement. They weren't getting value. Now, what does that mean? I mean, all of us operating in a digital space, don't we want to create a personalized experience for people? And I guess the challenge here is that we're really walking a fine line between trying to deliver that personalization, that like bespoke one-to-one experience that we feel customers are looking for, but balancing that tension with these concerns about privacy. And it's something that many brands, if not all brands operating in digital space, need to navigate to keep customers from opting out. Why would they opt out? Well, when we asked them, as the consumers around, well, what makes you trust brands with your data? One of the most popular responses, the third from the top, was that they are more likely to trust brands that collect a minimal amount of data or only the necessary information. You really combine that with the experience that around preferencing privacy over personalization. And essentially, what's been happening is that consumers provide their data. The brands absolutely get value up from it. Some of the highest valued organizations globally are organizations that house and hold the most data about consumers. And yet, consumers don't feel like they're getting value in return. One of the interesting things that we wanted to explore was what do they actually consider to be sensitive personal data? And what we found were some really interesting things like date of birth, address, bank details, phone number, current location. This kind of classification, let's label it as personal data here, were considered to be some of the most sensitive types of information about a consumer. What was really interesting though was what consumers felt were the least sensitive types of information. Uh, Things like browsing behavior, product searches, filters, custom settings, past purchases. We'll call it interaction data for the purposes of today. And what's really interesting is that if consumers are providing a lot of the personal data that we're seeing on the left and not feeling like they're getting value exchange, the question is, well, why do you keep asking me for this? I don't see the value in you asking me for this beyond saying, hi, John, in say a personalized email every now and then. I guess where the opportunity lies, though, is how could we actually use the type of information and data that consumers don't feel is sensitive, so this interaction data, to try and deliver the value that we have been trying to do through gathering that personal data. And what's been quite interesting as part of our Insights Roadshow when we've been sharing this with clients is there's been some really interesting examples of how this can be brought to life. One great example and is something that we've started to call this concept of data proxies. So, what are examples of interactive data that we could use as a substitute for personal data in order to find a one-to-one match or better for what we're trying to deliver to customers by using their personal data? Really good example on the right-hand side here is with Temple and Webster, where rather than trying to give them a gift voucher for their birthday, which requires a consumer to provide their date of birth, they've actually used a data proxy of the anniversary from when they became a member with Temple and Webster. Uh, this is actually really clever, and I'm starting to see more and more of examples of these coming up because it's not just using the same, creating the same benefit as getting someone's birthday information. It's not just using data that you have already about the consumer, but it's actually a stronger connection back to the brand because you're going, hey, can you believe that this is your fourth year of signing up to be a member with Temple and Webster? Let's celebrate it. And it creates a really great connection between the brand and the consumer. Now, we've spoke briefly about data breaches before. Obviously, when it comes to experiencing a data breach, the first thing that is impacted is your trust towards a brand. But it's not just about that because what we've seen is there is absolutely a material risk of churn that happens after a data breach occurs. On the right-hand side, we actually asked this for some specific breaches that occurred, but we also wanted to ask it more broadly for anyone who's experienced the breach. And what happened? What did they actually do as a result of their data being breached? What we found was a third had switched immediately after a breach. Close to another third actually planned to switch, but haven't done so yet. And interestingly enough, another rough third don't plan to switch. We don't have time to deep dive into what might be driving that, but there's some really interesting cognitive biases that exist that even though there might be a cause of frustration, the grass is not necessarily greener, and people might prefer the devil they know, if that makes sense. Some other interesting stats was that we found that 2 in 5 Australians claim to have had their personal data compromised before. but many of them weren't actually sure what type of data had been leaked. And another fifth were actually completely unaware if the data had been breached. Together, all these interesting stats really highlight the widespread uncertainty in the market, and it's really created a sense of unease in the modern digital world. There's this both a degree of apathy around brands actually doing anything of value with their data, but then once their data is in the public domain, they feel like they lose control of it. And then it's just at the whims of the most sophisticated hacker who can access this data. I guess what brands can do here is it's just about highlighting the importance of being proactive. Consumers really feel that sticking to the status quo is not enough. To pull ahead, brands really need to do better by being aware of customers' data needs. So if a breach occurs, we know trust can be easily lost. There's a saying that it takes years to build trust, which can be lost overnight if a data breach isn't handled correctly. So it's really important to prepare for the worst so that if a data breach occurs, brands can respond immediately and make sure that they can equip customers with the information they need to make an informed decision on how to move forward. It's interesting because they don't just project the blame onto brands. Consumers are actually quite aware that they may not themselves be doing the best in terms of data security practices themselves. So we found roughly half don't know how to secure their personal data. Two-thirds don't know what they would do if their data was compromised. A third use the same passwords across platforms, and another third use very basic, easy to remember passwords. All of these create a kind of stacking risk, and I'm sure many of us here might be guilty of at least one of these. And I guess if we're trying to understand how can we best support this group, it's really about going, well, the world of data is full of unknowns. And by helping guide customers through those unknowns, brand trust associations will naturally strengthen. So it's really important to remain conscious of, well, what's the degree of trust that's associated with your brand or your category? Are you in a more trusted industry when it comes to data? For example, government, healthcare services, banks, where they house a lot of data. So there's an expectation that they use the most rigorous protocols to protect it. Or are you on the other end of the spectrum where there's a lot of skepticism around what brands do with trust? Online brands, like brands that operate purely in the online environment, social media platforms are another example where there is a high degree of distrust associated with them. Knowing that context, it's really important to really provide relevant, as meaningful support as much as possible to help keep customers' data secure. One final point before I move on to the next batch of insights is that consumers demand transparency in how their data is handled. And it really signals a crucial role for brands in fostering trust. So 90%, almost universal, of Aussies think that companies should be more transparent about how they intend to use their personal data. It talks about the importance of providing informed consent for consumers to actually know what their how their data is going to be used and to make sure you don't break trust by doing anything outside of those boundaries. And a final point, we did a lot of really interesting explorations around the power of things like T's and C's, because that's often where brands typically communicate how they intend to use their data. Most consumers honestly said that they do not read T's and C's. I'm probably guilty of that as well. I think I saw a recent data point reported that in order to read all the T's and C's end to end that you commit to every now and then, it probably takes 48 days to read them end to end. That's not realistic for anyone. So there's an acknowledgement that it puts consumers in an unfair situation to expect to read them. And so when you look at the data point here, where 3 in 5 believe that brands shouldn't be allowed to share their data, even if they've agreed to the T's and C's, which allow the brand to do so. They feel like that's not a fair way of just going, well, you agreed for this, so you're bound by this and we can do whatever we want. There are some really interesting shortcuts that can be done here. As an example, we saw a brand essentially put like a Cliff Notes version of the T's and C's next to them that essentially call out specifically in plain English what they're committing to. And the lawyers who might be listening to this call might be arguing that that's not good enough compared to the real T's and C's. But I guess the counterpoint is that it's better than not reading them at all. So really just trying to make sure we as brands can make it as easy as possible for consumers to understand what they're committing to is really key when it comes to data transparency. Awesome. Now let's chat about Gen Zs. Oh, where do I start? Let's not talk about any of the lingo because I'm going to sound super, super millennial doing it. But what we're actually seeing with this generation is that this is one of the first generations where they have grown up exclusively in a digital environment. Every other generation prior to this has kind of evolved with the technology as it's progressed. So we understand the underlying structure of how they're built. Even think of like computer filing systems as an example. We're quite naturally know to go to for PC users, my computer, documents, whatever folder I'm looking for, and understand this kind of natural hierarchical structure of how things work. The best way to kind of explain Gen Z is to use the analogy of a transit system. I've just used the Sydney Rail network as an example. The same applies to Melbourne and many other rail networks across Australia where they're quite clean looking. You might see this, I guess, high concentration of rails around the city loop as an example, and some really clean linear paths to varying areas around the city. This is very much designed around ease, where if you know where you need to go, there's really only one way to do that. And you jump on it, you sit on the train, and you go all the way to your stop, and that's it. Nice and simple. I guess a counterpoint to this is like looking at the transit system of Tokyo. And for those who've never been, you could look at this and go, this is sheer and utter chaos. What do I do here? But as any local could tell you, and any tourist after a day, it's actually really, really intuitive. And what it does is it gives you so many options to go, cool. So say I want to go from Metro Tokyo and I want to go all the way to Ikebukuro. Pardon the pronunciation, that was horrendous. But there is more than maybe 10, 15 different routes that you can take at any one point. This essentially puts us in the position of a choose your own adventure. And this is really where we're seeing the trend for Gen Zs in terms of their change in behavior compared to other generations in the digital environment, where we're seeing a trend moving away from a preference for ease to a preference of self-empowerment, helping give Gen Zs the power to self-personalize their experience. It's a really interesting difference. And as we build on that conversation earlier on about this preference for privacy over personalization, I think the nuance there is really they don't want brands to personalize things for them. They want to be given the tools to personalize their own experience. Very slight nuance, but it makes a fundamental difference on the customer's digital experience. Now, what else are we seeing in terms of shifting across these generations? One of the other things that we're seeing in the data is the shift in consumer attention. Really great example is on social media. We're seeing attention shift away from who do I know? So classic example being Facebook, for us corporate people, LinkedIn, where it's really about connecting to the people in our network to find out more about them and what they're doing. Turning away from that and moving more towards what and more content specific followings. So a really great example is something like TikTok, where the For You page is really designed and consumers are quite cognizant of this. And the algorithm of TikTok is designed for someone to browse on TikTok. And if they see something they like, they can dwell on it, engage it in however way they want, knowing that they'll get more of that. And if they see something they don't want, they'll swipe and continue. What this is doing is giving consumers the power to actually choose what they want to see more and more often. And what's really interesting is that we're starting to see that shift and trend of self-empowerment expand beyond just Gen Z, but also to millennials as well. So really, really interesting data point is once on TikTok, millennials are on average spending more time on the platform than any other social media. So that includes more than like nearly 1.5 times more than that on Instagram. This concept of self-empowerment is a great example where consumers can actually choose and control what they want. Just as a question more broadly, I'd love to kind of pose like, how could we do that for our own brands? What's an example, an adjacent example of how we could bring that to life for consumers in our own industry? One final thing before we wrap up, we're also seeing another way that attention is shifting is we're seeing a movement away from loyalty programs to paid memberships. So whereas the last 5 to 10 years has really been characterized by every brand having a free loyalty program, where consumers are quite cognizant that they're not necessarily free because the data is where the value is, to the rise in paid memberships. So what we did was we looked at these different kind of paid memberships, and what we found was that 2 and 3 Gen Z and millennials are now subscribed to a paid membership. Compare that to just under half of Gen X and a quarter of baby boomers subscribe to paid memberships. It's really interesting to try and understand, well, why is that? Like, what's driving that? One of the things that we saw in the data, though, was that these paid programs are extremely effective at driving loyalty. So we asked that question explicitly, just going, of the brands that you use, do you exclusively shop here instead of competitors because of the loyalty program? And as you can see from the data here, the story is clear. They're absolutely getting value and really driving loyalty. When I talk about value, these are examples where these programs work so well because they over deliver on the value exchange. This is just some screenshots from my phone. But just to give an example, don't judge me. I have a family. But the amount of savings on delivery fees, as an example, on by being a Woolworths Everyday Rewards member, how much we've saved on delivery fees for Uber. I mean, Amazon is obviously unbelievable, but in terms of what you're saving for delivery fees, getting access to Prime, they stack value in a way that it makes it a non-negotiable not to have these, and consumers really resonate with that. I've gone on for a while, so I'll leave it there. But thank you so much for listening. Um, as I mentioned before, I'm John. If you're interested in getting access to the full report, reach out to me directly on LinkedIn. Happy to have a chat. I'm going to stop sharing, and I wish you all a fantastic evening.